We are connected already within our most authentic selves, with others, and with the cosmos. This is something that can be cultivated and has multiple layers to it. There's our connection with our deepest selves. There's our connection with others, with the collective, our connection with nature, the cosmos. And then there's our connection with reality, capital R. However we each understand that, whether that's the divine, God, the universe, consciousness, the sacred, source, whatever language, there's that layer of connection. And this might all sound great to say, yep, we're connected. Good. Wonderful. But the question is how? In what way are we connected? And how do we cultivate that in a deeper sense and lived reality of that? It's something we need to get out of our just conceptual knowing of it and then really get our heads and our hearts and our experienced reality to be deepened into each of these layers of connection. If it's just conceptual, our ability to live full and compassionate and creative lives is going to suffer for it. So let's dive into one layer of connection at a time. In this video, I want to overview each of these in a little bit more detail. And then in future months, we'll be releasing specific reflections going into greater depth with each of these layers. And that's something you can get here on our YouTube channel, but also if you want to sign up for our newsletter at tablecollective.art, and we include it in that as well. Before we get started, I just want to invite us to pause, to get centered, take a few deep breaths. If you need to pause the video, that's fine. But as you listen, I want to invite you to notice if you're drawn to a particular layer of connection. Is there a place that you want to cultivate a deeper experience of it? And I invite you to notice what ideas feel inviting, what ways of seeing the world are you drawn to naturally, or are there things that you have an aversion to where you're like, I don't like that way of seeing things, or I find that problematic, or that feels maybe just weird or unfamiliar to me. Just note it. It's neither good nor bad, but just to see where that might be coming from, and to sit with the things, especially where you feel drawn, and to follow up on that in future months and in your own practice and ways of experiencing life. So let's get started with our connection with our deepest selves. There's many ways to talk about our interior lives and identities, and there's no way of getting around the fact that our being human is complex. We're full of mixed motives, complicated emotions, we have ambitions and desires and longings and hopes and fears. And generally, we're not aware of most of these things at any one time. We often live disconnected lives. We're unaware of what's happening inside of ourselves. We don't always know why we feel the way we do in the moment, or why we act the way we do. And we can be unsure of what we really want and end up playing roles to meet others' expectations in life, rather than living out of our own authentic and deepest selves. This is because so much resides in our unconscious. It's our shadow self, as Jung called it. It's what we learn at a young age, that there's some things that either our parents or society or others we interact with don't seem to appreciate parts of who we are, and we end up putting those things in our unconscious. We don't live out of those in the same way. We push them to the side. Doesn't mean they're not there and not still exerting their force and power in our life, but just means we're less aware of them. And so part of our work is to bring greater awareness to those things. In the language of internal family systems, there's many parts to us, and each part have different roles and things that they're doing in this broader internal family system, as the name suggests. And so that takes some work to unpack what is happening here. What are the relationships, even within my own self and desires? What might be going on here? And with all of that happening, it can be difficult to answer the question, well, who am I? Or to discern and make decisions around what is mine to do in life. So at a practical level, knowing ourselves is a journey of deepening connection, it's self-understanding with self-compassion in the process. It involves getting to know how we're wired, to know our own triggers, our own motivations, our compulsions, those hurts and pains and hopes and longings, the things that are shaping the course of our life, the current of our life, that we're not always fully aware are there. But who we are is actually a really old question that's been answered in a lot of different ways throughout history. For some, our deepest self is some enduring soul or that has a substance to it that goes on. For others, this deepest self is actually in union with the divine, or ultimately the same as the divine. that same cosmic self that holds everything together. For Buddhists, there is no self, at least not in the ways that we think of ourselves as an autonomous, isolated, separate, inherently existing entity on its own, apart from everything else that's arising. But however we each view this, the contemplative and mystical traditions each seem to say in their own way that our deepest selves are intricately connected with reality. We're not separate or distant from our source. Or framed differently, we're inextricably woven into the fabric of everything. And it's possible to cultivate and to have a deeper realization of this connection that is already there, to find that we're not alone. And we can live more whole and integrated lives full of compassionate and creative energy. That moves us to our next layer of connecting with others in the collective, because the ways that we connect with others naturally flow out of the ways that we connect with ourselves. Our attentiveness and self-awareness directly impact our ways of attending to and connecting with others around us. Our ways of listening, of practicing empathy and connection depend on our ability to see the person in front of us and pay full attention. And that's hard to do if we can't also notice and pay attention to ourselves and bring that to a place of stillness to really companion another person. Our hearts have to be open, full of compassion, and that's not possible if we don't have compassion for ourselves. Those who are rigid or critical usually are even more critical on themselves on the inside. If you can hear inside of their head, it's worse than whatever they're saying out loud to others. And so that softening begins by doing our inner work, making that bridge between our own deepest self and how we interact with others. How we understand our own experience of what it means to be human is going to shape how we view the dignity of others too. So if we can experience ourselves as integrally connected with reality, capital R, it means we can begin to see others as reflecting that too. And this is true whether we think of our humanity in terms of being a suffering sentient being that's one with consciousness that needs to be liberated, or whether we see ourselves as a human made in the image of God, or someone who is one with the divine as a drop in the ocean, a self in the self, capital S, a lover made for union with a divine, a beloved, a creature made by a creator, or maybe as an integrated part of the cosmic whole. Whatever our ways of doing these, of seeing these things, there's worldview differences between them, but the point is that our experience of something of this for ourselves can change us. It draws us into a loving action on behalf of others and the collective. One practical example of this that I want to share is Thomas Merton, who is a Catholic. He's a Trappist monk. He's known for work in interreligious dialogue and social activism. He famously had a mystical experience in Louisville at the corner of 4th and Walnut Street. So I want to actually share some of his own words with you. He writes, "I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness. The sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me, now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this. But it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. There would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed." So this experience on its own was surely wonderful and enlightening, but it also marked a shift in his life. It changed his focus and his writings to move towards greater social engagement and action outside of his cloistered experience as a monk before that. He became involved in peace and civil rights movements, and he sought out interreligious dialogue with Eastern traditions and practiced a kind of humility that he clearly actually wanted to learn what others were experiencing and what they had to share as insight and wisdom for the world. So this type of mystical experience naturally leads to the question of how we are connected with the collective. by which I mean wider society and ultimately all of humanity. What is it that binds us together? Well, first, we're not just connected with those who are alive now. Many cultures and traditions have ways of intentionally honoring our connection with our ancestors. There's multiple ways of thinking about this connection. For some, this is going to be an expectation, actually, to have interaction, to have experience, intuitive spiritual experiences and dreams, visions, other types of ways of knowing and sensing that is understood as actual interaction with their ancestors. But beyond that, there's also so many cultures and ways of celebrating and honoring the dead and the ways that they have lived on a legacy, however that's conceptualized in terms of their being with us. There are so many variations of how that is done. And they're onto something, that we are connected to our ancestors. There's the undeniable connection, just even purely in terms of our family lineages. They're interwoven with histories and whole communities and wider families. And the further back you go, the wider that might get in terms of who they impacted. And not just who's biologically related to one another, but what was happening at the time. Who were they close to? What impact did they have on others' lives? And we're part of that. There's this wider web of all of humanity that really does connect us and bring, as we look at the current reality and our families and people we know now, there's a deeper layer here to recognize. And if that's not enough, we can also count among our ancestors those individuals who have been models to emulate or founts of wisdom to drink from, people who have shaped our culture, our history, and our lives in unmistakable ways. It can be personal role models or thinkers or people who lived lives of compassion and creativity that we are just drawn to. They're among our ancestors too, in the way that they're impacting us. And underneath all of this, though, is a question of whether we're connected in some more all-encompassing way. Is there something wider that's actually happening that's connecting us under it all? Is there a collective unconscious? Is there an underground stream of life, heart, wisdom, guidance, ideas, and influences that is there to draw from? Of course, we're all connected more technologically and culturally. We're more globally aware than ever before. But ontologically, in the nature of being, is there something that actually exists? And I'm going to come back to these questions in a bit when we get to the fourth layer, talking about our interconnection with reality. Because at this point, I've actually made it all sound rather complicated. This connection with others in the collective can get quite theoretical. But at the end of the day, most of us actually need to start with the embodied relationships with those around us in our physical spaces, but also maybe those who aren't necessarily that close to us, but like our families, our friends. What are the ways we relate to our mother, our father, our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, our grandparents, and beyond? And how do we have the good boundaries and also a generous heart full of compassion for all of them? Our connection is actually lived out in really concrete ways most of the time. And there's compassion practices and creative prompts that can help us to surface and heal blocks in our own hearts that might make some of this hard. That we're able to live lives with deeper interconnection with those who matter most to us. And the more we cultivate our ways of seeing everyone with compassion, we're going to increasingly be able to see and name the injustices, to work for healing on that collective level as well. And of course, all of our human interactions are actually embedded in the wider sphere of nature and the cosmos itself. That us humans, us conscious, self-aware mammals, are embedded in natural systems, whether we like to forget it or not. And one helpful lens for processing our interconnection with nature and the cosmos is the idea of interbeing. This is something that Thich Nhat Hanh describes that I really appreciate and want to share with you. This quote is from his book, The Other Shore. It says, "If we look into the sheet of paper, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. Without the sunshine, nothing can grow, not even us. So we know that the sunshine is also in the sheet of paper. The paper and the sunshine are. Looking more deeply, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. We also see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread. So the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in the paper as well. Without all of these other things, there would be no paper at all. And he continues this line of logic, suggesting that we are also in the paper when we begin to observe it, that our interaction, our perception actually has an exchange, that there is something that happens in that. He doesn't go into all the details, but that gets into how we understand physics as well. And he concludes, everything, time, space, the earth, the rain, the minerals in the soil, the sunshine, the cloud, the river, the heat, and even consciousness is in that sheet of paper. Everything coexists with it. To be is to interbe. You cannot just be by yourself alone. You have to interbe with every other thing. This sheet of paper is because everything else is. In other words, we're embedded in the arising of life, the always interdependent moment with every other natural system. And so to deepen our understanding of interconnection with nature and the cosmos, we can also look at the many multifaceted indigenous traditions as sources of wisdom that point to our need to live in harmony with nature, to be part of a wider community of creation. We're in a living universe sharing kinship with everything. There's real relationships, a reciprocity, and a responsibility to care for one another, to tend the land and receive everything with gratitude. And that's quite corrective to the many ways that we are destructive, abusive, taking things and destroying rather than sustaining the life around us, seeing them as relatives, seeing them as kin, as those who are in a wider community of creation. So that's something that we can pause to really receive from. And there's so many different cultures and traditions that have this way of being that we really need to respect. Another source that we can look to is the work of physicists, which points to our interconnection with everything in the cosmos. And here the language of entanglement is used to describe ways that at a quantum level, things just don't work in ways that Newtonian physics would express that they should. And so the wild thing is this isn't just that there's an entanglement across the distance of a petri dish, but that it's actually cosmic in scope, that connections between particles can happen. And so while we might not feel much connection with a star system 14 billion light years away, quantum theory is saying that there's actually a much more complex web of connection. There's forces woven through everything here. So whether you're drawn to the conceptual and scientific descriptions of our connection, or the Buddhist reflections on our interdependent arising, that everything is coming together mutually, that we need each other and connected in it, or if you're drawn to the embodied wisdom of nature-based spiritualities, there are rich resources to help us gain a deeper understanding of how we exist in relationship, to get out of this idea that we exist on our own, are self-made, or that that we are not embedded in our natural surroundings. And this can help us to cultivate a sense of the sacred throughout it all, to see it both in the mundane, the day-to-day, and in that like cosmic scope when we look at the stars. And there's way more spiritual streams and resources I could point to here. But for now, I want to turn to the layer of our connection with reality, or the divine, or our source, or consciousness. In many ways, each of the other layers has asked the same question, which is, what is the underlying nature of our interconnection? Is there anything more? Any wider frame of reference, any ultimate reality that connects everything? And if so, is it the fabric of the cosmos? Is it outside of it entirely, separate, but creating it? Or is it something in between? One way of answering this question is to say that the only things that exist are material things. And this stance still allows us to embrace many of the nuanced layers of interconnection I've been mentioning, to see quantum entanglement, to see our interdependence that's found throughout the cosmos and natural systems, in our human relationships, and in all the complex human-made systems as well. But to return to the question raised earlier of, is there something more, a collective unconscious? Is there something else happening here that's woven through ourselves, through one another, and through the cosmos? If all of reality emerges out of a primordial consciousness, that it's, rather than being material, it's now consciousness-based, then it would not be a surprise to see that unconscious connections between people at all. Because in that case, our conscious awareness is not actually separate from the consciousness itself anyways. That is our deepest self. It's not a separate self the way we usually think of ourselves. And of course, in a worldview where all form, everything that is that we see in matter, is a manifestation of consciousness, then it wouldn't be a surprise at all to find that all of the cosmos, including all of nature and human relationships, is intricately connected throughout in that primordial consciousness. That we are non-dually actually part of it, an expression of it, manifest. In theistic approaches, so ones that are believing in God in some way, shape, or form, if God is the ground of being in which we all live, move, and have our being, then it's not hard to conjecture that there's a deep connection between all of humanity and the cosmos in God. And there's some options of how we might understand this, so I'm going to unpack them in a little bit more detail here. One is to see the divine totally outside of material world and the way that we experience it, to see that as creation, but God outside of it. And in this case, perhaps spirit could be the connecting tissue, or the sinews between people and places, the intermediary that connects our hearts and lives to make humanity one as the divine is one. And so a practical example of this, which actually can be explained in all sorts of different ways, different worldviews, but it's a common experience for many people, is to have, when there's an emergency or something going on, just to have an intuition, to have that person come to mind. And if they're a praying person, they might feel like they need to pray and might just send love in that direction, whatever that might be. I think this is an experience that's not uncommon, to have someone come to mind and not know why, but just to sense that there's a deeper connection with that person. From this perspective of seeing God outside of creation, you might say, well, it's spirit who's prompting them to pray or to pay attention, to draw that connection. Or in a pantheistic approach, everything is held together in the divine, but there's still an ineffable and a transcendent mystery of God beyond the cosmos. And so here too, it could make sense to say that God is the one in which we live and move and have our being, and that there's this connection, this pointing out of like, hey, pay attention to that person, send love their way. But the question here is, how separate are we and everything else from this love that is running through everything? Many contemplative and mystical figures across traditions almost flirt with this line of separation as they pursue or are drawn into union with the divine and experience sacred reality throughout everything. They come really close to saying, well, maybe we are the same at our deepest level. But it remains maybe this ineffable mystery where the line becomes very vague. And that points us to the last theistic expression I want to talk about, which is where we can view our vast interconnection in terms of our deepest self quite literally being an expression of the divine, where our self is in the self, capital S, the self that is bringing and manifesting everything into being. That the world is this cosmic self at play. And in that case, we're fundamentally connected with everything and everyone. And in many ways, this is a theistic mirror of that kind of consciousness-based way of seeing things. But there's some nuanced differences that come into play when you get into the lived religious and spiritual traditions and art and things around it. Very different cultural connections and contexts, but some similar understanding of the connection that's happening. And there's, of course, many other ways of conceiving of our connection with the collective humanity. For example, there's Jungian ways of seeing archetypes, which is noting the recurring images and metaphors and roles across human cultures in many times and places. And so it then raises the question of whether, is that something that ontologically, on the level of being, is that something different? Or is that actually just a way of talking about what seems to be happening that we might understand in another way through our connected consciousness or our connectedness in the divine or our source or the universe, or however you want to frame that. The point in briefly surveying all of these things is to show not where you should land in seeing the reality, the divine or source or universe, but rather to name some larger categories of possible spiritual streams and approaches. That each of these provides pathways for the deeper cultivation of our sense of connection, of really bringing that full circle to we have to experience it and wrap our hearts and minds around it in a deeper way for our connection to really matter. And so there's so many different ways of cultivating our sense of devotion or union or non-dual emptiness or oneness. The language shifts, and some of the worldview things are quite different actually when you dig into them in more nuance. But they're all getting at, in some way or another, a pathway to help us to connect more deeply here. So the way we see it, which hopefully leaves room for many ways of personally understanding it, is that reality or source of the divine is love, compassion, grace, kindness, tenderness, beauty, creativity, and joy that connects and flows through our creative and spiritual selves, through all of us and through everything. And our hope in all of this is that each of us is able to more deeply connect at each of these 4 levels or layers of connection and to experience that you're never separate or unloved. So to close, I want to invite you to pause. Reflect on what you noticed in yourself as you listened. Were there 1 or 2 layers of connection here that you were particularly drawn to? Was there a way of seeing things that was either new to you or stood out as something you want to explore more deeply? Were there things that maybe you had aversion to that felt uncomfortable? And if so, that's worth noting and sitting with as well. That can be informative of where that's coming from in ourselves. But whatever's coming up for you, listen to it. See what invitations might be there for you to more deeply explore and cultivate that sense of connection, knowing that you are beloved, that you are not alone, that you're not separate, and that these are each different ways of cultivating a greater sense of compassionate and creative connection with everything.